The Boston University School of Theology is proud to present the biannual Lowell Lecture, generously supported by the Lowell Institute. These SDH Lowell Lectures feature renowned speakers related to theological schools and studies. And I'm really grateful to the Lowell Institute for its visionary generosity in partnering with the School of Theology for many years now to provide this space of learning, awareness, and conversation. I also want to express my hearty thanks to Andrew Kimball. He probably just left the room, but he's been very, very important in facilitating this conversation. There he is. Thank you, Andrew. And he will want me to remind you that you'll find on your chairs surveys. We would really appreciate if you would take the time to fill out that survey after our time together this evening. The distinguished speaker of this spring's Lowell Lecture is the widely venerated and admired Dr. Marcia Riggs. Dr. Riggs is a leading ethicist who served as Columbia Theological Seminary's first J. Erskine Love Professor of Christian Ethics, having now recently retired this past August 2024. Dr. Riggs' lecture today is entitled, as you see up there, Womanist Moral Imagination for Living in an Absolutist Culture, and it explores how womanist moral imagination helps answer the question, how do we facilitate authentic moral community? Our moderator this evening is Dr. Emilie Towns, who will provide a more thorough introduction to Dr. Riggs and also introduce our two respondents, who are Dr. Luther Young, Jr. and Ronda Barnes, a PhD student here at BU School of Theology. Let me say a few words of introduction of our moderator this evening. And it's hard to do it in a few words because she's pretty amazing. Dr. Emilie Towns is a native of Durham, North Carolina, and an American Baptist clergywoman. She is the Dean Emerita and former University Distinguished Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Divinity School and the College of Arts and Science, becoming the first African American to serve as Dean of the Divinity School in 2013. Prior to that, Dr. Towns was Andrew W. Mellon Professor of African American Religion and Theology at Yale University Divinity School. Indeed, Dr. Towns is a scholar and leader of several significant firsts. Just a few examples. She was the first African-American first woman to serve as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Yale Divinity School. She was the first Black woman to serve as president of the American Academy of Religion, starting in 2008. And Dr. Towns is the first Black woman to hold presidency of the Society of Christian Ethics, a role she began this year, I believe, in 2025. No, prior? Finished it this year. Oh, sorry. That's important. And as you may well know, Dr. Towns is the author of multiple monographs and edited volumes, including Womanist Ethics, Womanist Hope, In a Blaze of Glory, Breaking the Fine Rain of Death, and perhaps her most groundbreaking work, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. She's the editor of A Troubling in My Soul and Embracing the Spirit, as well as co-editor of several volumes including Faith, Health, and Healing in African American Life, and a reader in Womanist Theological Ethics, and Walking Through the Valley, Essays, Womanist Explorations in the Spirit of Katie Geneva Cannon. There's many more things I could say about Dr. Towns, but we are delighted to have her now as our MLK professor. But please join me now in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Emilie Towns.
Good afternoon. I am honored to introduce our speaker for the Spring 2025 Lowell Lecture, Dr. Marcia Y. Riggs. She is one of the most astute, analytical, and incisive Christian ethicists of our time. When she applies her expertise as a womanist thinker, she opens up possibilities while addressing the sometimes grin realities of our time. We are blessed to have you join us, and we await your lecture with great anticipation. I know where mediation has come from. Dr. Marcia Riggs has an undergraduate degree in religion from Randolph-Macon Women's College, a Master of Divinity degree from Yale University Divinity School, and a PhD in religion and ethics from Vanderbilt University. Her teaching career began at Drew University Theological School in Madison, New Jersey. She joined the faculty of Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia in 1991. In April of 2006, Dr. Riggs was inaugurated as the seminary's first J. Erskine Love Professor of Christian Ethics and retired as Professor Emerita on August 1, 2024. The Marcia Riggs Commons, a residential hall and space for communal gatherings, was dedicated on the campus of the seminary in 2022. Her 20 years of ordained ministries were served in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. She is engaged as a lecturer and has published articles and books on womanist ethics, sexual gender justice, moral education, public discourse, and public policy. Some of her publications are Awake, Arise, and Act, A Womanist Call for Black Liberation, Can I Get a Witness? Prophetic Religious Voices of African American Women, and Anthology. Plenty Good Room, Black Women versus Male Power in the Black Church. And let me just say, when that came out, we asked her if she was trying to get kicked out of the church. She smiled. And she is co-editor of Ethics That Matters, African, Caribbean, and African American Sources. Ruth and Esther, Belief Commentary Series, whose release date is April 2025. Dr. Riggs was awarded a 2017-2018 Henry Luce III Fellowship from the Luce Foundation and the Association of Theological Schools. Her research project was Envisioning and Practicing Beloved Community in the 21st Century. This research project is the basis for a forthcoming book in which she develops her ethical theory and practice called Religious Ethical Mediation. Religious ethical mediation prepares 21st century leaders to address religion, conflict, and violence in a transformative manner. Her topic tonight, as you can see, is Womanist Moral Imagination for Living in an Absolutist Culture. Oh, the places we will go tonight. Welcome, Dr. Riggs.
This is my first time out after a year continuing to recover from a fall. So, hopefully, all will go well. I am, even as a lecturer, I can think of myself first as a teacher. So I'm inviting you into a dialogue with me. It's not so much about what I'm going to say to you, as much as I want to hear about how you're going to respond to it. Okay? So let's have some fun if we can, okay? I know no one wants to hear about September 11th anymore, but I think it's the prelude to this moment that we find ourselves standing in. And this particular quote from the book Encountering Nationalism, I think, is a good place for me to at least begin And it reads, "The crisis of September 11th revealed the force of nationalism in the United States in various ways. Political leaders urged people to come together as Americans to do their part in this war against terrorism. Patriotism was used to mobilize the public to give blood, to donate their money, and to defend territory. At the same time, with few exceptions, national and local political leaders invoked the language of war and militancy to console a grieving and anxious people. Post 9/11 grief and anxiety. What a way to find solace in war and militancy. And I think that's really why I say it's a prelude to the violent energy that we find ourselves dealing with right now. In the words of President George Bush at the National Cathedral on September 14, 2001, we find what that consoling words sound like. War has been waged against us, he says, by stealth, deceit, and murder. This nation is peaceful, but fierce when stirred to anger. This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing. End of quote. President Bush's remarks signify an absolutist point of view that is focused on us versus them, and in particular, good versus evil, and us against them because they are evil and we are good. So the first kind of absolutist, the way in which this absolutist culture sort of gets its life is by focusing outward in anger and fear. Then in 2012, the Pew Research Center published a report entitled Partisan Polarization Surges in Bush-Obama Years. That revealed the political divide during the Bush-Obama years increased more dramatically than the division of U.S. society based on race, gender, class, and education differences. In fact, by 2017, the Pew's political typology report revealed a kind of continuum of partisanship. But it was a continuum anchored by core conservatives on the right and solid liberals on the left as extreme poles. The absolutist point of view of being extremely different from one another turned inward. And in 2021, this polarization became manifest full-blown as Christian nationalism. And according to Whitehead and Perry, let's see if we can get it up. I always hate these little clickers. I never get the right side going at the right time. Whitehead and Perry, in their book, Taking America Back for God, say that Christian nationalism is significant because its calls to take America back for God are not primarily about mobilizing the faithful toward religious ends. It is about seeking to retain or gain power in the public sphere, whether political, social, or religious. Christian nationalism is therefore ultimately about privilege. Christian nationalism is used to defend against shifts in the culture toward equality for groups that have historically lacked access to the levers of power: women, sexual, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, end quote. The attack on the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters on January 6, 2021, revealed, if we didn't know, the depth of Christian nationalism. As it offered us to the world, it offered to all Americans and to the world a visual display of the divisive and polarized United States. There was a collision of the fear and anger of many Americans that the United States is under attack, an outward attack, and that the United States was headed in the wrong direction. We experience now, at this moment, fear and anger taking control in the White House, as the executive orders of President Trump and the actions of the Department of Government Efficiency dismantle departments and reconfigure agencies that were at least attempting to keep the pillars of our democratic way of life in place for we, the people. Because some of us have always, however, been marginalized members of we, the people, we were not surprised to hear the following declarations from the president's recent speech to a joint session of Congress. And I quote, "We have ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and our country will be woke no longer. We have removed the poison of critical race theory from public schools." And finally, he says, "I have signed an order making the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female." And actually, lastly, he declared English the official language of the United States. So, in this moment in which we find ourselves, we are reminded that we live in the omnipresence of violence. And this violence happens in all kinds of places. We've seen it, it's televised. But this violence is also happening in many forms in which we participate and in which we are complicit. And that violence may be psychological or spiritual, and we often aren't fully aware of the violence we participate in. This is the case because violence happens during our daily interactions with one another. The ways that we daily disrespect, silence, marginalize, objectify, and fear the other are all part of the omnipresence of violence. To speak of the omnipresence of violence is to remind us that violence is not only televised events, nor is it episodic. It's part of the social fabric of our lives. Even as we listen to the president's recent declarations, we find violent language that threatens and erases alternative points of view and groups of people. When this omnipresent violence is anchored within the cultural framework of contemporary Christian nationalism, we then find this description from Whitehead and Perry, again, helpful. They say, Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that blurs distinctions between Christian identity and American identity, viewing the two as closely related and seeking to enhance and preserve their union. It is undergirded by identification with a conservative political orientation, though not necessarily a political party. Bible belief, premillennial visions of moral decay, and divine sanction for conquest. It is the conception of morality that centers exclusively on fidelity to religion and fidelity to nation. And its primary assumptions are nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. A second earmark of this moment, the first earmark is the omnipresence of violence of this moment. A second earmark of this moment is a need to establish absolutist parameters. Now, I'm using the term absolutist to describe the current dynamics of polarization and the emergence of this, what I call a culture of absolutism. I do not wish to engage in a philosophical argument for or against the need for absolute moral prohibitions or against moral relativism. Instead, I want us to think about the absolutist parameters as describing a moral point of view that is rigid, non-empathetic, non-adaptive, and non-responsive. This moral point of view is premised upon creating and sustaining dichotomies. And the central norm of this culture, with this absolutist morality, is exclusion. Now, what I mean by exclusion at this point is that exclusion as a norm can function in one of two ways. It might be descriptive or it may be prescriptive. When exclusion is descriptive, the intent is simply to define the distinctiveness, because groups are defined by what makes them unique and what is to be required to be counted as a member. Operating from a descriptive norm of exclusion, the group may decide, though, that they want to invite others to join them or choose to engage with others about how the group might expand itself. However, when exclusion is a prescriptive norm, the intent of the group is to close its borders. There is no desire to invite others in or to engage with others. In the culture of absolutism, as we are now, those who have power over others also have power to define who belongs in the group. Those in power, in fact, redefine who is a legitimate or acceptable member of the group, and then they expel or deport some members who are deemed not to serve the interests of the powerful. At this moment, I assert that we are living in a culture of absolutism with a norm of prescriptive exclusion, wherein those in power are redefining who counts in our society and are therefore warping any notion of moral community. So, how do I want to interface with this culture of absolutism? Since I'm a womanist, I decided womanist moral imagination is the way to go. And I start with womanist liberation. First, a word from Anna Julia Cooper, A Voice from the South, 1892. Only the Black woman can say, when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole race enters with me. This quote by Anna Julia Cooper points to what's at the heart of womanist liberation ethics. That is, a moral self who is committed to not simply proclaiming her and his identity, but does proclaim it, only the Black woman can say, in the undisputed dignity of my womanhood. This self is not, however, disconnected from others. Then and there, the whole race enters with me. She is a socio-historic self, embodied in and through community. Womanist liberation ethics asserts that the moral self is a responsible self who asks the ethical question, who am I to be and what am I required to do as a socio-historic self, embodied in and through community? Asking the ethical question as socio-historic selves means that the moral anthropology is one that is no longer holding rationality at its center. Our ability to reason has long been the primary earmark for what makes us human, and therefore what makes us capable of discerning what ethical responses are required of us. Instead, this moral anthropology holds that it is relationality, our need and our ability to relate to one another as embodied beings. And that is what makes us human, and thus capable of discerning what the ethical requires us to be and do. As socio-historical relational selves meet, the ethical encounter is intercultural. Womanist liberation ethics, then, is intercultural encounter. This means that the ethical is one intrinsic to who we have been created to be. We've been created to be in relationship with others. And two, it emerges as we encounter others with whom we seek or find ourselves in relationship. Intercultural encounter is therefore not simply a description of a way that we need to live. It is, in fact, what morality is. Intercultural encounter is what womanist liberation ethics is. It means that we come to discern rightness and wrongness, that which is fitting and liberated as we encounter others. This is the case because it is not until we have some embodied others that we have designated as friend or foe with whom to engage that we can fully ask ethical questions about character and agency. So, womanist liberation ethics is constructed in the experience of intercultural encounter. Now, when I think about this theologically, I turn to an interpretation of 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 21. Theologically, womanist liberation ethics is driven by interpretations of the Imago Dei, of the ministry of reconciliation, and the Spirit of God. The interpretation of the image of God asserts that we, in all our socio-historic embodied differences, incarnate the Imago Dei. We have been created by God in God's image, and that image begins to come into focus when we encounter one another as we seek and or experience relationship. However, because we name and know ourselves through socially constructed lenses, we frequently see and experience one another out of focus. We see and experience one another and attribute meaning that in effect may annihilate our actual embodied differences, and often leads us to label one another in ways that judge, dismiss, objectify, and silence. And when this happens, we do harm. And that harm is psychological or emotional, and sometimes it's physical. It's also oppressive, manipulative, coercive, and exploitative. And therefore, the harm we do in any of these forms is violence. Living out the ministry of reconciliation is the way to disrupt the violence of the conflicts that can accompany intercultural encounter. The reconciliation that God effects through Christ is actually recreation. God creates us and God reconciles us. Creation and reconciliation meet in Christ. We are socio-historic embodied selves who are imago Dei, who are imago Christi. Reconciled and recreated in the image of Christ, we have a new creation. Reconciling is recreating. Thus, reconciliation is not an end, but a process. Furthermore, the Spirit of God animates reconciliation as process and guides us through our intercultural encounters. First, the Spirit of God is womanist spirit. In the book, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, Alice Walker proposes a 4-part definition of womanist. But it is that third part of her definition that I want to talk about here, to talk about what womanist spirit is. That third part says, loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. The Spirit of God as womanist spirit sustains an ethical openness of loving the Spirit as the way to love others in intercultural encounters. Loving the Spirit happens A, in the context of creativity, B, in connection to the cycles of life, C, as expression of the erotic, pleasurable embodiment, D, living into the tensions of conflict, E, in solidarity with community, and F, self-knowledge, as well as self-love, all as a matter of moral courage. Second, the Spirit of God is the Holy Spirit that, from our perspective, brings the church into being at Pentecost. However, it's the way that Diana Eck describes the gift of the Spirit at Pentecost that I would like for us to think about when we think of the Spirit. She says, the freedom made so clear, and I quote, in the winged flight of the Holy Spirit forces Christians to think about the mystery and power of the spiritual life among people of every faith, Buddhist and Muslim, Hindu and Jewish. When we use the term Holy Spirit, we mean the active, creative, energetic, mysterious presence of the one we call God. The Spirit does not read the fine print of the prayer book or the creed. The Spirit, though she gave birth to the church, is not the possession of the church, let alone any of its early church fathers or its modern theologians. The Pentecost experience reminds us that the Holy Spirit is above all a gift, fullness, and outpouring. We cannot grasp it. We can only be attentive to it, awake to it, and attest to its presence. End of quote. As X quote reminds us, the Spirit of God is not something that we understand intellectually, but it is something to which we must be open and receptive. To be guided in our intercultural encounters by womanists and this Pentecostal understanding of the Spirit is to be enabled to do what I call religious ethical mediation, REM. So what is this mediating intercultural encounters in the spirit as REM? REM is the praxis of ethics as intercultural encounter and is the ethical praxis of a theology of reconciliation. Reconciliation as praxis, therefore, is to be understood primarily as process rather than an end that we're going to reach or attain. REM is about mediating the tensions, the conflicts of living with others with respect to that which is one, religious, meaning that which gives our and others' lives ultimate meaning, from which our and their morality derive. Two, ethical, those virtues, values, and visions for life that describe and prescribe who we and they are and what we and they do as individuals, communities, institutions, and society. And three, mediation, which is about the processes of living into the tensions of intercultural encounter. The practice of REM is about nurturing citizens and people of faith into a relational worldview and a transformative orientation to conflict. And there are 4 basis points for REM. The first is transformative mediation. And Robert Bush and Joseph Folger, in their book, The Promise of Mediation, Responding to Conflict Through Empowerment and Recognition, make clear that transformative mediation is a process, that has unique potential for transforming people and engendering moral growth. The aim of transformative mediation is to ensure that a process for moral growth, for grappling for meaning in the midst of conflict happens. It's not about, have we managed the conflict? Is the conflict over? It's about whether or not we have transformed the conflict and therefore we have morally grown. The second base point is dialogue. Dialogue, I know we hear that all the time. We use dialogue constantly. But dialogue is more than conversation. Dialogue is communication that nurtures relationship. This is the case because dialogue is based upon mutual respect and listening and learning from one another over time. Earning such respect comes through a willingness to accept the otherness of others. Dialogue is a process of direct encounter. David Bohm, who's a physicist, writes about dialogue. And what I find most interesting in his description of dialogue in the end is this. The picture or image of dialogue is that of a stream of meaning flowing among and through us and between us. This makes possible a flow of meaning in a whole group, out of which may emerge some new understanding. It's something new which may not have been when we started out. It's something creative. And the shared meaning that we create, in the end, is the glue or the cement, to use this term, that holds people and societies together. So that's the kind of dialogue I wish we take the time to have. The third base is intercultural and nonviolent communication. And the one intercultural communication specialist asserts in order to truly have intercultural communication, we've got to overcome the golden rule. Because the golden rule encourages sympathy, and sympathy is insensitive to difference and can become patronizing and defensive because of assumptions of similarity. Empathy, on the other hand, begins with the assumption of difference, the recognition of the uniqueness of individuals, cultural and social group differences, and the recognition of diverse interpretations of the same events. Furthermore, there is an assumption of multiple reality, that we are each individually and as groups creating reality through the construction of narratives about our experiences and our events. In effect, empathy as intercultural communication is intellectual and imaginative participation in the experience of the other from the perspective of the other, rather than assume that I can understand your experience because it is like mine. I assume that if I am to understand anything about your experience, I must assume that we are different and respect the difference. So the fourth base point is, I'm going to speed this up because I know it's getting late, is moral imagination. And of course, turning to John Paul Lederach, who is the theorist and the practitioner of conflict transformation, that's where we get the definition of moral imagination that I play with and I'm inviting you to play with. His understanding of conflict is that it is a normal and continuous dynamic within human relationships. So again, we want to transform it. We don't want to run from it, for goodness sake, or we don't want to manage it. And so in order to think about conflict in this way as transformative, he says we have to have a notion of moral imagination. And that means the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist. So when we engage one another as religious ethical mediators, moral community emerges in spaces where there's transformative mediation, dialogue, intercultural communication, and moral imagination. And I use the term space rather than place because it is in moral community as place where an understanding of orthodoxy goes unquestioned, where an ideal becomes a capital ideal, and where tradition always has a capital T. And we become fixated upon it, and things become rigidly authoritative. In moral community as space, living together is dialogical interpretive processing of the conflicts of intercultural encounter. Moral community as space is simultaneously a space of the omnipresence of God's justice and the omnipresence of violence. This space is simultaneously filled both with the energies of the Spirit of God and energies of conflict. When we enter that space as a religious ethical mediator, we direct the energies toward creative, generative purposes that allow the ethical to emerge rather than have energies of conflict that are just fomenting destructive purposes and therefore violence. So this is the definition of moral community that I'm working with. But as I said, moral community is something we create, and it's a space we create. So according to Spohn, moral community refers to the network of those whom we recognize an ethical connection through the demands of justice, the bonds of compassion, and a sense of obligation. justice, compassion, obligation. When morality is driven by partisan polarization, the complex interrelationship of fear and anger destroys our ability to have this sense of moral community with others. And it does so primarily because there are two kinds of fear at work. One is fear and anger concerned with loss of power, loss of status, loss of privilege. And two, fear and anger concerned with devaluation, fear of being dismissed, objectified, or misperceived. Practicing religious ethical mediation requires that each individual and or social group must be engaged in processes of self-criticism and mutual criticism. Everyone in everyone's group must ask themselves about how they're living along three moral axes. One, the ethical axis, which is where are you along the moral ethical axis from complicity to accountability to responsibility? Where are you along the theological axes from confession to forgiveness to proclamation? And three, where are you along the social justice axis? From that which is corrective to that which is compensatory to that which is distributive. And to speed this up even more, here's graphically what REM looks like. On a good day, I actually have it moving. It's not moving, but hopefully you can see the energy that is supposed to be happening when you are imagining yourself living in the context of God's creation, God's justice, the omnipresence of God's justice. At the same time, you're living in the omnipresence of violence. And what makes this possible in a way for us to imagine what it's like is because we're also always living in the overlap between two synchronous cultures, a culture of deception and a culture of moral courage. And what can really help us out is that the Spirit is larger than all of it, moving, propelling us, directing us. And so conflict, remember, is energies. It's something that can be redirected. It doesn't have to be destructive. So if you want to be a religious ethical mediator, you're going to be willing to walk into that overlap, that space of overlap between these two cultures, and invite others into the overlap, because that's where the ethical will be created and emerge. If we want to get over this culture of absolutism, we have to be willing to imagine ourselves as morally courageous enough to be the persons who stand in the overlap no matter what else is going on. Often when I try to teach this material, well, when I was teaching this in class, there's always the question, well, what if the other people don't want to, It's not about the other people. It's about us. When are we going to make some commitments to live in that courageous space and see the ethical emerge? REM asserts, and this will be the final thing I say, that moral community is constructed through intercultural encounters in which we acknowledge A, the particularity of our differences. That means we recognize and honor the moral relevance of embodiment. B, we acknowledge the contextuality, the site of our encounters. So, sometimes we really need to think about micro context. We're ready to talk about how we're going to change the world. But what's going on in your school here? I spent my last years at Columbia as the ombudsperson, trying to help practice REM and invite others into that overlapping space. It's interesting, y'all. It really is. And we have to remember, C, the historicity of our encounters. That our encounters emerge in relation to a past, a present, and a future. And lastly, we have to remember that we all have biases. And the biases of our interpretations are what we must dialogically engage. As moral community emerges, we, each individual and groups, must remain committed to our different confessions and professions, but without being absolutists or universalizing about them. Whereas the culture of absolutism is marked by certitude, the practice of moral community requires womanist moral imagination. That means we are called into a space to create moral community, to allow it to emerge. Thank you for your patience. And how do you all want to proceed? It's getting late.
As I said, oh, the places we will go. Thank you, Dr. Riggs. I now introduce your two respondents. Dr. Luther Young Jr., or shall I say the Reverend Dr. Luther Young Jr., is a sociologist of religion who studies the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and religion. Much of his work seeks to address class inequalities, racial injustice, and systems of discrimination against LGBTQ+ communities and other disadvantaged groups. Dr. Young's recently published articles examine how homophobia in the Black church is expressed and perceived by parishioners and suggests potential ways to address non-affirmation in these spaces. Dr. Young's forthcoming work, tentatively entitled The Silent Contract, further illuminates the complex relationship between Black sexual minorities and Christianity and theorizes potential pathways forward. In addition to his research, Dr. Young is an ordained Disciples of Christ minister and serves as council moderator of the Disciples LGBTQ+ Alliance. He is the pastor of worship and spiritual formation at Lighthouse Church of Chicago and is involved with various councils, committees, and community organizations dedicated to anti-racism, justice, and equity. Our second respondent is Pastor Ronda Barnes, who is the founding pastor of Affirmation Church, a church without walls, and a fourth-year student at Boston University School of Theology, where she is pursuing a PhD in practical theology with a concentration in homiletics and a certificate in spirituality studies. Pastor Ronda is a graduate of Emory University's Candler School of Theology, where she received her Master of Divinity degree and a second-level Master of Theology degree. She also holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from the University of Akron, a Master of Arts in Journalism from the University of Michigan, a Master of Arts in Practical Theology from Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta, and a Juris Doctor from Yale Law School. Her academic writing interests include homiletics, spirituality studies, critical animal studies, and womanist Christology. Her most recent publications are Menstrual Blood and the Blood of Christ, Streams of Strength, Vulnerability, and New Life in Black Theology, and A Particular Oneing, Zilpha Elah as a Model for a 21st Century Womanist Contemplative Homiletic, in a special edition of Homiletic, for which she also served as guest co-editor. Prior to entering ministry, LaRonda worked as an administrative law judge, appellate court attorney, legal aid attorney, and law professor. She was the first African American female elected as chair of the American Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division in its 75-year history. As leader of the 150,000 member volunteer association, she promoted its public service and professional development programs, headed its legislative assembly, and served as its spokesperson at conferences around the world. LaRonda is an avid traveler and a nature and animal lover who enjoys taking walks, reading, singing, and playing the flute. I leave it now to the two of you to respond, and then after that, I will open the floor for Q&A.
We should have rocked, paper, scissors beforehand. Well, good evening, and thank you, Dr. Riggs, for this enlightening conversation starter for us tonight. So much that I'll be chewing on for quite a while, so thank you so much for pouring out. And I'll try to keep my comments brief so that we can hear from the illustrious LaRonda sitting next to me and to have some Q&A from the room. But even as I was reading the abstract for this talk, I got excited. And what kept sticking with me is the notion of fear. Because fear is so powerful. And I would say that much of kind of the problematizing that we see hinges upon fear, this very powerful emotion. And I was reminded of a book by Christopher Bader and colleagues entitled Fear Itself, The Causes and Consequences of Fear in America. And so they did this study and tried to empirically examine the culture of fear in this country and its social and political implications. And so they used data from the Chapman Survey of American Fears. It's this national survey that asked about 95 different dimensions of fear, from terrorism and crime to natural disasters and arachnophobia and fear of clowns. So they really ran the gamut. And, you know, they noted that among the top fears for Americans were political corruption, pollution and sustainability issues, financial insecurity, health concerns, and the list goes on from there. But one of the things that stuck out to me was they found that Americans are becoming more fearful over time. And what makes this culture of fear so insidious is that its feelings and the subsequent response is not always rooted in reality. And in times of growing uncertainty, people will grasp onto conspiracy theories. So the book talks about how America is this conspiracy nation. Because such theories, they say, quote, facilitate the feeling of holding an exclusive truth, or one might say an absolutist sort of truth. Even though what folks may actually have is really what I would say is alternative facts, perhaps. And so you have this culture of fear that exists, and when people are afraid, they lose their minds, they abandon reason, even behaving in ways that will contradict their own interests, right? And so I would argue that this culture of fear is rooted in a fallacious capitalistic ideology of scarcity, which engenders this false necessity for competition that masquerades as work ethic, but is really just greed. So that's a mess. So what do we do about this? I don't have the answer to this question. How can we prevent ourselves from succumbing to this downward spiral of fear and animus? How can we speak truth to power? How can we do justice and love mercy and walk humbly when there are so many competing definitions of justice and mercy and humility? I had a professor by the name of Emilie who taught me that when you ask a question, you should start to answer the question. So I will offer a couple of words. If I were to begin to answer those questions, I would turn to the work of Dr. A. Elaine Brown Crawford in her book, Hope in the Holler, a Womanist Theology. And so Crawford in this book examines how hope has existed as an engine of resistance for Black women and how we can learn from that. And so she says that hope is the bridge from oppression to liberation that facilitates full humanity and fosters an undaunted passion for life. And in this work, she describes hope not as passive. It's not waiting for things to get better in a later lifetime or in the afterlife, as so many of our churches may seek to promise. Rather, the type of hope that Crawford describes is active, intentional, and courageous. And so to me, that links perfectly with this religious ethical mediation framework that encourages folks to step into these courageous dialogues. And although my question still remains, and this will be, I think, good for conversation, how can we move beyond these crippling feelings of fear? And what can be that bridge that gets us to a point of courage where we can engage? I think hope is a step in that direction, but I'm hopeful for dialogue that can maybe help us get there. Thank you.
I guess the interesting thing is the language of how do we move beyond the fear? And part of what I'm trying to push folks on is it's not moving beyond it, but actually delving into it, and being willing to engage in the kind of dialogue that allows us to hear our differing interpretations, that ground our fears rather than, we're going to get beyond it. No, we're going to.
I am going to say that with Dr. Towns in front of me, and Dr. Riggs beside me, I'm in womanist heaven, am I not? I am really honored to be able to respond, and to do so, I've put on my womanist hat, as they say. For myself, I identify as a womanist, as a Christian, not of any denomination, and not non-denominational, just plain old Christian, and as an African American. And I say that with hesitancy because especially since around 2020 when I had time to sit by myself and think about things, um, I have difficulty with that American part. So I have looked much more to Africa and to studying languages and cultures in Africa because there is a realization that our womanist scholars teach us and our history, when we look especially at 19th century African American women like Zilpha Elah, that no matter what we do or how many degrees we have or what we wear or where we live, you know, this country just does not care. They just don't. It is ingrained, and I'm going to say ingrained in us, not just in other people, in all of us. It's in the water, it's in the soil. But what womanism has done for me, and womanist thought, is that it has helped me to look at my past in a different way, to look at my ancestors in a different way, those that I know, like my grandmother and my aunts, and those that I don't know and never will know. And to see both their struggles and to see that joy, that hope, that ability to last and survive and find community and relationship in a country that continually seeks on a daily basis to destroy us. I guess it was Audre Lorde that said to survive as a Black woman in America. Yeah, you've done something. You've accomplished something major. And part of that is also something that has opened for me of wanting others to look into their ancestry and to use that knowledge not as something to be ashamed of in the quest for the American dream, but to use it as something both to guide us as to who we are and to help us share our stories in ways that we can reach into that middle space and live into the tension and into the fear and have those discussions. And so my kind of questions I'm going to put out for Dr. Riggs and Dr. Towns, excuse me, because I'm not going to start answering them. I'm just going to put them out there. All right. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. With the womanist hermeneutic that you are proposing, based on this experience of African American women, how do we recognize the particularities and not fear the connections, the inspirations, and comparisons that arise from our own experiences and the particularities of our own history and ancestry? You quoted Walker's definition of womanism, part of it. Another part of it from part 2, she says that a womanist is committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, not a separatist, except periodically for health. Traditionally a universalist, as in, Mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow, and our cousins are white, beige, and black? Answer, well, you know, the colored race is just like a flower garden, with every color flower represented. And I would submit that here at STH, we're very similar to that flower garden. People of all ethnicities, of growing international community that brings a lot of different ways of being and speaking and engaging in the world. And often students from other schools, especially the law school, who come over here seeking something that's spiritual that they can take back when they speak of discernment and vocation. And so I ask you, in the midst of that garden, and bringing all the ancestral heritage and experience together, how do we go into the classroom space and share those stories, bring those stories into the space in our particularity without not only causing pushback, but causing pushback in a way that we then no longer share stories. Where it becomes not, and we say a lot, safe space, and I'm a person who believes that in many ways we have to create our own safe space. We walk in it, just as we walk in the fear. Right? But I also think that it is difficult many times to say, okay, I'll share my story, especially as a marginalized person, right? Whether that's a womanist, whether that's a feminist, and then someone else want to share their story and they get a pushback, right? You don't know that experience. Your experience isn't as traumatic as my experience. Your experience doesn't speak to the US, your experience speaks to something else. And the conversation tends to shut down right there. It's like we just aren't gonna go there because we want to be beloved community and we don't want to cause too much disruption. And so for you, I would like your wisdom to us is when those things arise, and especially I'd say for the students, how as a student do you then, what do you recommend to come back, whether it's in that class or the next class or after class? What's the recommendation so that people continue to share the stories that we need in the space? And the other question arises from the Spirit, which you spoke of that definition of Walker, loves the Spirit. And in an academic context especially, where we have a myriad of views of what spirit is, and especially at STH, I think we range the gamut from not only from very conservative Christians, progressive Christians, but people of other faiths, people of no faith, people who see spirit, prayer, all those words very, very differently. How do we bring that spirit into the space? And especially, not only in our spirituality classes, but especially in the classes that aren't spirituality classes, where there may be a pushback because this is academic space and we don't do spirit in academic space, right? So those are my two questions for you, and I will leave that as we move towards the Q&A.
Well, the interesting thing for me is, sorry. The interesting thing for me is that, and this is where I was when I left Columbia. It's actually the teacher in the room who has to take more responsibility for enabling the space to be one in which the sharing of the different stories can happen. I mean, I'm not going to ever tell a student just be more courageous. Really? I'm going to start with the professor and say, you know, if you envision your classroom, what does it look like? Is this a community of learners, or is this a space where you get up and tell people what to think? If it's a community of learners, then you as teacher have an incredible responsibility to keep the space open. So, I mean, I've written an article that uses this for pedagogy for that very reason. It's all about also having done training in conflict transformation and mediation. One of the things we have to do is also learn how to reframe what it is we want to see happen. So by that I mean a professor who says, I really want everybody to share their stories. But I'm like, okay, I actually had this happen while I was ombudsperson. A student came to me because she said, we've all written stories and we're supposed to share them. And the professor let someone get up and share a story that was incredibly homophobic and never said a word. So I said, well, what do you want to do? You want me to go with you to have a conversation with that professor? And at first she looked at me like, really? We can do that? I said, yeah, I think we have to do that. And so I set up a dialogue. And I mean, the colleague, and I'm just going to be honest, the colleague was this young white dude who looked at me like, oh, you're coming with the student for us to have a conversation about what happened in that classroom. Yeah, let's do it. And it was interesting that somehow he was missing that everybody else was uncomfortable with the story that had been shared. He was like, this person met the assignment. I'm like, really? You didn't notice the people squirming and, some people even leaving the room? Because the student said, by the end of the class, did you notice there were only like 3 of us? And until teachers can become mediators of the space of learning, it's always going to break down. So I know that's not satisfactory, but that's the bottom line, is teachers have got to think about, what does it mean to enter this space I call a classroom? I tell people the first thing I know, there's already energies for conflict in the room. Let's accept that. They're there. Now, how are we going to direct the energies? That's our task.